Well, hello, good evening, and welcome to episode 116 of Fracking Nightmare. Now, I'm delighted to be able to welcome a guest who's been on Fracking Nightmare before, but over recent weeks, she's been doing what she does best, which is be a pain in the proverbial to the establishment via asking freedom of information requests. So it's absolutely with pleasure that I welcome Helen Chunso to tonight's episode of Fracking Nightmare. Helen, can you hear me there?
Yes, I can. Good evening, Ian, and thank you for having me on to talk about this.
It's an absolute pleasure. Now, Helen, before we get on to your sterling work via FOIRs, as I'm sure you're aware, breaking news today is that Hart Hill, which is in South Yorkshire, has been granted via the planning inspector, granted INEOS permission to start exploratory drilling there. So, Helen, were you aware that coincidentally, the planning inspector shares the same family name as the barrister who represented Quadrilla last week?
That is a happy coincidence, isn't it?
It really is, isn't it? Yeah, Stephen Roscoe, the planning inspector, concluded, and my thanks to Ruth Hayhurst and drillordrop.com for this quote. Stephen Roscoe concluded, "I have found that the development could have a negative but not significant impact on features of biodiversity value for the period of the development. I've also found that the development would detract from and be harmful to the landscape and visual character of the surrounding area. These matters would not, however, outweigh the benefits from the investigation proposed in terms of future energy supplies, to which I give great weight." Well, it might as well have been Tom Roscoe from or representing Quadrilla, because it's almost paraphrasing exactly what he said last week. What's your thoughts on his comments there, Helen?
I think there's a repeated failure to actually understand the urgency of the situation that we're dealing with, and unfortunately planning inspectors are not giving the correct weight to the right considerations. He's just proved that again, hasn't he?
Well, he sure has. I mean, there's obviously, once again, total disregard for the views of the community, because when Rotherham Metropolitan Borough Council took the vote on this, it was a unanimous vote against granting INEOS permission to proceed. So despite the fact that it was unanimous, I mean, which is pretty unequivocal, he still went ahead with the recommendation. And the response from the local MP, Sir Kevin Barron, who's been the MP for, I believe, for Rother Valley since about 1983. So I think he knows the area pretty well. And he said, "I'm very disappointed that INEOS have been granted planning permission for fracking in Hart Hill. I will continue to fight this decision, as I still believe there are too many unanswered questions around fracking." And, well, that's certainly the case. And not least, of course, is the reference to Professor Peter Stiles' report, which I discussed in the last episode of Fracking Nightmare. But just to revisit, because I think it's extremely pertinent, this is a graphic that I have extracted from Professor Stiles' report. And, of course, his report is entitled "Fracking and Historic Coal Mining, Their Relationship, and Should They Coincide?" And as I iterated last time, Professor Stiles is not anti-fracking. He is, by his own admission, ambivalent on that, but he believes that any industry should be appropriately regulated, and of course not proceed until every factor has been taken into account. If we go back to this graphic, what you see here on the left-hand side is the Yorkshire coalfield and the major fault lines that lie under that coalfield, which are known to the British Geological Survey. And what you see on the right is the coal mines in the north of England, which ironically, of course, generally sit above the Boland Shale. And if we look at another graphic that I've taken from Professor Stiles' report, and I show you there, I've added the ellipse and the arrow, showing you where the Hart Hill well site is. And the Hart Hill is otherwise known as Common Road, right in the middle there. And as you can see, the proposed well basically is right over a major fault. So, and this is one of 3 intended exploratory wells that INEOS want to drill. This one down at Marsh Lane, which is in North Derbyshire, where the county council voted 9-1 against granting INEOS permission to proceed. But these other 2 are in South Yorkshire, and this is the first one to be subjected to the public inquiry at Hart Hill. And there it is, slap bang over the old coal mines. And so, like I said, I somehow doubt that Mr. Roscoe took into account Peter Stiles' report, which may come back and bite him in the proverbial butt. So, what could possibly go wrong? Well, I want to start our discussion, Helen, by showing a video of a blowout that occurred just a few months ago. In fact, on February the 15th of 2018. And this was in Powhatan Point in Ohio. And this is an unconventional gas well that got out of control. So let's just take a look at this.
Helicopter 2 to Unit 1031.
'78 to plane 2, stand by, I'll get him.
Okay, we're just letting you know we're overhead now. We'll start taking some pictures.
Okay.
Ten 1031, you have traffic?
Right, on the plane. What plane number? '31, plane 2.
Okay, that was footage taken literally just a few hours after the blowout occurred on the morning of February the 15th of this year. Helen, anything strike you about that frac pad?
It's a similar size. It's actually in an unpopulated location.
It's only about a mile away from the nearest community. But if you recall that frac pad, and then take a look at this one here, which I'm sure you will be familiar with. Now, the 2 frac pads, but this one, which is Kirby Misperton, before the equipment was removed. But the frac pad in Ohio was nothing like as congested as this, right?
Well, I don't think it'd be possible to have anything as congested as the frac pad at Kirby Misperton.
So
but yes, it was clearly room for emergency response to get onto and off site, and I saw that there was some attempts to actually quench the fire there.
yeah, so
I imagine
basically
that vehicles could revert into an
exactly.
exit that site too.
Exactly. The access to that site was effectively free and clear. So, I mean, that blowout occurred after the well had been fracked, and basically the frack spread had been moved away from the well. So the emergency services were able to actually get to the fire, and we're going to revisit that fire as we go through the discussion. But Kirby Misperton here was a disaster waiting to happen. And I know that you, amongst many others, were extremely concerned about the access or lack of that the emergency services would have to that well site at Kirby Misperton in the event of any emergency.
Yeah, primarily because I have a history of working in health and safety, and I've actually looked at what regulations really should be governing the site. We were blessed with Third Energy at least pretending that they were going to adhere to COMA regulations.
COMA
because
being
the site did not
COMA, Helen,
require
COMA,
that they
COMA
adhere
being
to COMA.
sorry, COMA being
Control of major accidents and hazards. It's a requirement where a site is over a certain size or there's a certain level of risk. And unfortunately, because fracking sites come under a temporary premise, even though the extent of the hazards that are contained therein are so severe, there isn't actually a legal requirement that they come under COMA. So they're actually escaping under the radar from a health and safety point of view, because it's like saying you only have a bonfire in your house once a year, so therefore you don't need to move your curtains and get burnt. I mean, it's really that ridiculous, the scenario that we're dealing with. But at Third Energy decided to voluntarily adhere to COMA regulations when I pulled them up about their entire absence of an appropriate way of communicating with the local community in the event of a disaster. And to which the response at Kirby Misperton, Third Energy said that they would have a telephone tree. They said that they would take the numbers of the local residents and they could all ring each other up to tell them to get out. That was Third Energy's gold standard emergency evacuation scheme for letting the residents know. And I'm sure we'll have the opportunity to talk about what Preston New Roads is in shortly. But suffice it to say that telephone tree is an insult, especially where you shouldn't be using mobile phones where gases could potentially be igniting, let alone in a signal area that was as poor as the Habton Road was.
Well, and if we look at this second picture of Kirby Misperton, you can really see just how cluttered that pad is, and just how impossible it would be for the emergency services to get on that frack pad. Now, fortunately, of course, no frack took place at Kirby Misperton, but it wasn't due to any issues with safety. Ultimately, it was due to the fact that they basically were pretty much on the brink of insolvency, and they were only able to effectively continue operating because they took a bung from Barclays Bank to be able to pay off their immediate debts to the suppliers. But Greg Clark dreamed this one up, because this wasn't in the original game plan, but I think Third Energy obviously failing to publish their accounts on the 30th of September last year, having started to move kit on a week prior, somehow managed to blag right through until the end of January, when I think it was around about the 24th of January, Greg Clark announced that he would not sign off until he'd seen these accounts. And of course, when he did see them, I'm sure he pretty much fell on the floor in disbelief at what he was looking at. And by the way, Helen, I'm aware that a complaint has been put into North Yorkshire Police, asking them to investigate whether or not economic fraud has been committed by John Dewar of Third Energy for attempting to bring all the kit on, knowing that the company did not have sufficient financial resources to fulfill its obligations. So we'll see where that goes. So sorry, say again.
Actually, John Dewar knew that he didn't have the sufficient financial resources because the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, they didn't seem to know, and they're the ones that were supposed to know what kind of financial resilience the fracking applicant had. And unfortunately, the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy have declined in the opportunity to let me know what the financial resilience test for a fracking company is, and we're still waiting to hear from them what that is.
So we don't exactly have a great record of transparency at the moment, do we? It's fob off. Yeah, we're going to check financial resilience, but we're not going to tell you what the criteria are. So
we'll make it as we go along, and if somebody asks us and won't go away, we'll kind of come up with something and we'll tell you half the answer.
Precisely. So I just want to go back to that Powhatan blowout, and let's look at one of the first news reports that came out from the location there.
Right now at 5, a mandatory evacuation is in effect for a 1-mile radius around a well pad on Cats Run Road in Belmont County after a gas leak ignites, causing a fire that is still burning. Thanks for joining us tonight for 7 News at 5. I'm Tate Blanchard. Belmont County officials held a press conference just a short time ago updating us on this situation. And 7 News anchor Laurie Conway was at that press conference, and she joins us live from the scene tonight with what they have to say. Laurie, what are officials saying about this right now?
Tate, this whole situation started to unfold just around 9:40 this morning when a well pad owned by XTO Energy lost containment, resulting in gas being spewed into the air as well as a fire. Now that fire is currently burning on and off, and I'm being told it's actually a good thing when the fire is burning because that way the pressure is not building up. XTO Energy has flown in a team of experts from Texas who are currently taking a look at this situation. They are monitoring the air quality in the area, making sure that everything is safe. Now, right now, everybody in a 1-mile radius of this area has been evacuated from their homes, and they're waiting for the results of those air quality tests to determine if maybe that evacuation order could be scaled back or if it could perhaps be expanded. Belmont County EMA Director Dave Ivan tells me that they do not expect this situation to be remedied tonight. This is something that will be ongoing for at least into tomorrow. They do plan another press conference for 7 p.m. tonight. There is also a hotline set up for anybody who's been displaced. You can find that on our website, WTRF.com. Make sure you follow me for updates on Twitter at LConwayWTRF. For now, reporting live in Powhatan Point, Laurie Conway working for you.
So, Helen, that report went out literally a few hours after the blowout had occurred. And as you heard the reporter state, a mandatory 1-mile evacuation had been put in force, which effectively embraced the entire community that lived, well, literally just on the edge of that 1 mile. So, to the best of your knowledge, is there any such plan in place should a similar event occur at Preston New Road?
That isn't something that's been shared with us because apparently there isn't one. The best that we have is that the Lancashire Resilient Forum have a generic plan for these kind of things. I think that they are seriously misunderestimating. That would be a kind way of putting it. The other way of putting it would be entirely taking the piss out of the serious need for an emergency evacuation zone in the event of such a blowout. I think that they are completely failing to understand that an unconventional gas field, which they have here, would actually result in maybe more than a 1-mile evacuation zone, maybe a 3-mile evacuation zone. We are looking at the need to have places where people can go to be safe from the gas. Do they have any shelters? Do they have any breathing apparatus? Have they actually considered how children will be evacuated? Thousands of school children from Grammar and Carbot. Where are they plans to let the children know? and the teachers know, and the parents know in this case. This is not something that has been communicated. It's not in the press, and it's not communicated on a right-to-know basis, which we have in the United States for similar things where people have the opportunity to interact with resilience forums. We haven't got that here. This is secretive.
Well, we're going to have a look at some of those forums in the US shortly. But let's take a look here. This on the screen here, this is Google Earth. And so what we can see here is, this is obviously an old image of Google Earth, but the well site is in this area here, just to the west of Little Plumpton. And the prevailing winds do come from the west. So if there was any kind of blowout similar to that which occurred at Powhatan, then basically this area here, Kirkham, Wesham, Ribby, Ray Green, and then ultimately moving across towards Preston, and then eventually along to, if it's pure westerly, to Blackburn, Burnley, Nelson, Colne, before drifting across the Pennines into Yorkshire. And if, of course, the winds happened to be easterly, then, of course, basically, that all of the gas cloud will be taken straight over Blackpool. So here we are. If it was a 5-mile evacuation zone, that would effectively cover Blackpool, Lytham St Anne's, and all of these small communities right over towards to Preston. Now, less than a mile, or let me be generous, maybe a mile away, is Kirkham Grammar School. And there are certainly, I think, something like 2,200 pupils in Kirkham Grammar School and the schools in the immediate vicinity. So, as you rightly state, one would hope that every parent of every child attending school in that area is already fully briefed on what would happen in the event of an emergency situation arising at Preston New Road. So surely, because we have gold standard regulations in this country, or so we're told, so surely every single parent has already been advised of exactly what would occur, how the communication process would work, what to do in terms of picking up their child, whether or not they should travel, by which routes they should travel, or whether they should simply leave the child in situ and wait for further instructions. Surely all that has been communicated and it's simply not being shared with people who don't need to know.
I would go further than that, Ian, and say that plan isn't in place. And for any parent that had that level of concern for such a situation, I don't think that they would be able to get through on the telephone at the time of an incident like that. I would want to ask the head teacher of the school now what plans have been communicated with them in the event of an emergency evacuation owing to a blowout or a gas leak on the site. An unignited gas leak carries potentially a higher risk than an ignited gas leak, such as a blowout.
Well, that's a very good point you make, that actually if it is ignited, then it is somewhat safer than unignited. And let's take a look at a news report from a little bit later in the day.
Agencies from all over the state of Ohio are here in Powhatan Point working after a gas well became uncontained around 10 o'clock this morning. Residents in a 1-mile radius of the well pad owned by XTO Energy remain evacuated tonight.
What we're doing is taking an abundance of caution. We don't want anyone to be endangered by anything that could happen, so for that reason we've evacuated them.
The fire at the gas well has been burning on and off all day long, and a specialized team of experts from Cud Well Control based out of Texas were flown in this afternoon. Air and water quality tests are continuing near the site. Law enforcement officials ask that you avoid the area entirely, and if you are a resident, be prepared to show proof of ID.
Our biggest thing is safety of the residents, not only close to the well as nearby. What we're asking for law enforcement is the community and the people not to come up in this area. Don't come up, don't sightsee.
There is no timetable on a fix or when residents can go back to their homes.
Well, even the experts, a couple of them in there said we cannot give a timetable. Maybe tomorrow, maybe Saturday, maybe Sunday, maybe next week.
Belmont County Commissioner Mark Thomas spent part of the afternoon on scene, along with State Representative Jack Serra.
We've seen an incident similar to this in Monroe County, and it took a while. So, I don't want to say anything without having the information, but hopefully it can be resolved as soon as possible and everybody can be kept safe.
Officials attribute the quick and efficient response to training they've had for scenarios just like this.
Here we did what's called a tabletop exercise. It's where all first responders, members from the gas and oil industry, they get together and they talk about what ifs. And this particular road and this particular area was our example that we used. So we feel that we are very prepared for what happened today. That's why you had the quick response.
There are hotels set up for residents who have been evacuated from their homes, and Powhatan Elementary will be closed on Friday while work to fix the well continues. Make sure you watch 7 News this morning for any updates regarding this situation. Reporting in Powhatan Point, Laurie Conway, working for you.
So let's just look at, that was a very short news clip. That was just over 2 minutes. But let's look at some of the key phrases that were used there that seem to be missing in any discussion about this industry in the UK. First of all, the reference to an abundance of caution, and that they were undertaking air and water quality tests. That the biggest thing is safety for the community. That people may not be able to return home until tomorrow or maybe Sunday or next week. That the training they've had for situations such as this has helped them prepare for just such a situation, which of course they had also had another one occur some months previously. And then the statement that the elementary school would remain closed. Now, as it happens, that blowout was not finally dealt with for nearly 3 weeks. But that news report, which was put out in the evening of February the 15th, clearly shows that pretty much everyone knew the role they had to play, and it's a sad reflection on the industry in the US, but unfortunately blowouts are not uncommon. But everything fell into place. And of course, it was in an area that's a lot less densely populated than the Fylde Peninsula. So, Helen, I find it truly staggering that 5.5 years after the moratorium was lifted in this country, it seems that the corporatocracy is pushing ahead with an industry with flagrant disregard for the residents who live in the area. As we know, obviously, Lancashire County Council voted against Quadrilla even being given permission to establish this well site. That was 3 years ago, only to be overturned by a planning inspector and Saeed Javid, who was put into Parliament in 2010 to represent the interests of the global bankers. We've seen the same thing in Hart Hill today, where the community rejected INEOS's application, only to be overturned by a planning inspector. And obviously the planning inspectors have not made any reference whatsoever to the total lack of any kind of emergency planning. And because of the nature of the way in which the regulatory bodies are organized, everybody just does this. It's somebody else's problem. So, but surely we must be missing something, because surely, what I'm describing here is not an industry or a country where the politicians and the industry constantly repeat that we have gold standard regulation.
Well, it's my thought that health and safety is the first thing that should be paid attention to, whether you're pro-fracking or anti-fracking. So laying aside even the questions of the disgrace that this industry has done to democracy, there is life and death issues that are at play when you fail to provide emergency evacuation plans on a site of this magnitude. That does not just extend to the local community, who are, of course, very vulnerable, and who are, of course, the people that have not had any input in this, which is a disgrace, but also the first responders. I have written to Lancashire Fire and Rescue Service. I have also written to Lancashire Constabulary, and I have asked what level of awareness that those people, as staff working in the vicinity, have. I have had pages of atrocious 15 pages of atrocious attempts to fail to answer an FOI from Lancashire Fire and Rescue Service when I have asked them what equipment they have in place to protect their own men or women working at that site. I have asked them what gas monitors that they have, how many hydrogen sulfide gas monitors they have, what level of suits they have that would actually protect themselves, the police and the public in the event of this that could be disseminated. Lancashire Constabulary have a duty to their own workers. Then the police are being failed as employees to actually know how they would manage this situation. And I don't know if you recall, Ian, that recently there was a mini evacuation of the site at Preston New Road when the police failed to clear anyone out of the way and seemed to not know what to do. And that was just, I think, a taste of things to come. There is a lack of coordination between the fire and rescue service and the police and the council in doing this. And to say that the health and safety executive will actually make sure that this doesn't happen on the site is quite ridiculous. Gas does not stop at the boundary of the site. And saying that we won't need this is like saying that, we don't need maternity services because, we hand out contraception. It's ridiculous. There is going to be times when things go wrong on that site. And if something of this magnitude goes wrong, we will have our second Grenfell with the type of plan that we have in place right now. And I'm not prepared for that to happen.
Actually, you know what? I would say that what we're looking at potentially is something that is like Grenfell Tower and Aberfan all rolled into one. The difference, obviously, Aberfan, 1966. Unfortunately, I remember that day. I was 10 years old. I remember it very, very well. Where the coal miner, the coal board knew the slag tip was moving, and they did nothing. And they still let the children go to school. And then, of course, we have the tragic loss of life, and devastating for the community. And, obviously we've had other tragedies as well. We've had Hillsborough, we've had Grenfell Tower. And then eventually, some way down the road, we get a public inquiry and we get the stock phrase, lessons have been learned. Lessons have been learned, and nobody's held to account.
We get this lesson. We really need to act before we get this, because, we have absolutely everything in place for a disaster here if we do not heed the warnings that we need to have a plan that is coordinated in place. One of the things that makes a plan coordinated is if people actually know what equipment and what chemicals are on the site. And we all know that fracking companies hide in their permits the chemicals that they use under the guise of proprietary mixtures. We haven't even got an answer from Lancashire Fire and Rescue Service that they know what is on site. How are they going to fight this fire? And how on earth, in the event of a blowout, is anybody going to be able to do testing of the air quality when they have evacuated the area to let people come back if they don't know what they are testing for?
Well, precisely, and we'll look at the chemical issue in just a second. But I just want to bring this slide on screen because this is also from Professor Peter Stiles's report. And this is why we should definitely, and everybody on the Fylde Peninsula, should be concerned about Quadrilla, because it is a company that does not exactly have a great track record. And this is the spreadsheet of the fracks that were conducted at Priest Hall in 2011. And what you see here, after doing 2 stages of the frack job, one on the 28th of March and the other one on the 31st. The earlier date is the test. And then on the 1st of April, that triggered the first seismic event of 2.3 on the Richter scale. And on the 4th of April, and this is confirmed by Peter Stiles, and he says he was advising Quadrilla at the time. And there is the confirmation on the 4th of April, Quadrilla were aware that they had deformed the casing between 8,400 feet and 8,600 feet, and yet they still decided to proceed. They didn't advise anybody, and I've heard it said that they didn't advise anybody because it wasn't required of them to advise anybody. But there is the prima facie evidence from Peter Stiles' report that Quadrilla knew that they had deformed the casing by the 4th of April, and yet on the 8th of April, they ran a further test before doing a full frack, a 3rd stage of the frack on the 9th, and then went ahead with the 4th stage of the frack on the 25th, 26th, triggering a 2nd seismic event of 1.5 on the Richter scale on the 27th, and they still went ahead with the 5th stage of the frack job. And eventually Ed Davey, who was the Minister for Energy at the time, wrote to Lord John Brown, who was in 2 roles. He was David Cameron's energy advisor, but he was also chairman of Quadrilla. And Ed Davey wrote to him and basically challenged him and said, you know, basically this is incompetence in the extreme. And basically this kind of behavior led him to question whether or not Quadrilla was responsible enough to be a license holder, which of course subsequently cost Ed Davey his job. So here is the evidence as to why it is that people are concerned about Quadrilla, why that they are under such extreme scrutiny, which makes it even more staggering that no plans are in place. Now, Helen, I do want to draw people's attention to where they can actually look at the sterling work that you and others, but we're focusing on yourself right now, have been doing on freedom of information requests. And what you see on screen here is the website whatdotheyknow.com. So it's www.whatdotheyknow.com. And if you go to the search box at the top and you put in Helen Chunso, you will see what comes up is freedom of information request number 1 to 25 of about 84. Apparently the website doesn't even know how many freedom of information requests you submitted. And what you can do is you can scroll down here and you can look at the questions that Helen has asked, and then click on each of these and look at the responses that she has got back. And as you can see here, Helen's addressed the issue: emergency evacuation of the public, traffic management plans for emergency evacuation of Preston New Road, risk assessment and emergency plans to safeguard police working at Preston New Road well site. So even Helen asking the questions doesn't seem to have prompted any kind of action. It's just a case of, oh, well, we'll do what we can to bury the question and we will obfuscate. And in fact, our mutual friend, Ben Dean, actually asked a direct question. Is there an emergency response plan in place for Preston New Road? Yes or no? And he got 15 pages of gobbledygook in response. But the statement was that they couldn't share the information with him because it would potentially contravene the Terrorism Act, and they might be putting information into the public domain that could benefit terrorists. How outrageous and absurd is that?
Well, it's quite interesting that the Information Commissioner, when I took Lancashire Fire and Rescue Services attempt to obfuscate their lack of emergency planning and and joined up thinking with the police with me. They refused to answer a freedom of information request that you can see up there that I sent back in July of last year. It finally got, I asked for an internal review. They refused to give me that information on grounds of national security, because I asked questions that they thought would potentially endanger the well-being of national security. But the ICO were very clear about that. The ICO wrote back to Lancashire Fire and Rescue Service and told them to respond to me, and they refuted that entirely, and they said that that was not the case. In fact, what the ICO said was that there is sufficient information about fracking in the public domain, and this does not add to it, and that basically Lancashire Fire and Rescue Service should get on promptly with answering this high public interest case. Unfortunately, what Lancashire Fire and Rescue Service did in response to being told to do that by the Information Commissioner was to wait until the final day in which they were given time in law to respond to me, and they actually put that to appeal, an attempt again to abuse the FOI law to delay and frustrate. This is a technique that is becoming extremely boring when people ask questions of significance. The Commissioner also notes the considerable volume of information that is in the public domain. For these reasons, the Commissioner does not accept that provision of the information would lead to a greater threat of attack on the Preston New Road site, and that they conclude that they should that attempting to deny this information is not okay. We are in a position where the people that are supposed to be protecting us are colluding in the absence of what should be robust plans that they are communicating with us. They're trying to hide this from us. And the only reason that I can come up with so far is that there isn't a plan and it isn't adequate, and that the children at Kirk and Granite and the parents and the people on the local park, they're not safe.
Well, they live in a sacrifice zone. That's very, very clear. But, one would think that the local or the most senior police officer in the area, you would think that the Chief Constable of Lancashire, you would think that the head of the Lancashire Fire and Rescue Service, you would think that their professionalism would kick in and that they would be pulling together the necessary resources to put together that robust emergency response plan, even if it wasn't required by law. You would think that their own innate professionalism would drive them to make sure that this is in place, even to the extent of advising Greg Clark that under no circumstances should he sign off on any approval for Quadrilla to initiate the first pressurization of the well until such time as genuinely robust emergency response plans are in place. But it seems that today, these people who once upon a time would have prided themselves on their professionalism are simply placeholders. They are just put in the role, they take a salary, and they will simply do as they are told, knowing that if they don't do as they're told, then their promotion opportunities will be curtailed, and if they really go against the grain, they'll actually be moved into a role that is effectively a sinecure. So actually, this really is starting to be of an order of magnitude that is incredibly concerning. And I want to now show the last piece of footage from Powhatan Point. Now, this is a piece of footage that was recorded on, I believe it was the 3rd of March. So nearly 3 weeks after the blowout had occurred. And this is footage that is taken from an FLIR camera, forward-looking infrared camera. It's a certified optical gas imaging thermographic device and the guy taking it was a professional. So take a look at this footage, because what we see with an FLIR camera is the VOCs, the volatile organic compounds, that are not visible to the naked eye. So take a look at this. Okay, so what we saw there, of course, was the magnitude of the VOCs that were in amongst the other gases. And it's estimated that over 1 million cubic feet of toxic gas was leaching into the atmosphere every day of the little over 3 weeks that it took to cap that well. But even when the well is capped, the problems are not over, because those gases leach into houses. They leach into the wardrobes. They leach into soft furnishings, the carpets, the curtains. And basically, what we have seen at Porter Ranch in northwest Los Angeles after the horrendous gas leak, and this was from a gas storage well. And the reason this is relevant is, of course, that after the Lancashire County Council had rejected Quadrilla's application to frack at Preston Road and at Rossiter, Amber Rudd overturned the 13-year-old inquiry to allow the halite gas caverns just outside Fleetwood to be established. So the gas caverns of Porter Ranch, a smaller version of that, basically is designated for the Fylde Peninsula. So the Fylde may get a double whammy. What you see on screen here is a picture from the Los Angeles Daily News. This is the well that blew out. This is what it looked like after the blowout. Now, it took 3 months to deal with this blowout. And this is a picture taken with an FLIR, and you see how similar it is to the FLIR image from Powhatan. Now, here's a quote from an article. Now, we had a number of interviews with Porter Ranch residents on Fracking Nightmare at the time, and we also discussed what would need to be done before the nearly 7,000 residents were able to return home after the blowout was capped. And one of the ladies who guested on the show, she had everything in the house dry cleaned. It cost her $7,000. But a lot of people didn't have that kind of money. And sure enough, Now, some 2.5 years later, the health effects are really starting to manifest. And here's some quotes from the article. When the 2015 explosion first occurred, thousands of nearby residents were sickened by the methane leaked into the air, which was blamed for nosebleeds, headaches, nausea, and various other health issues. In January, residents reported that they smelled gas again and were experiencing symptoms even after the leak was reported plugged. 2 years after the worst gas leak in US history, health officials and residents in a Los Angeles, California neighborhood are still concerned about the impact the methane blowout had on their health. When a storage well underneath a mountain in Southern California's Aliso Canyon erupted on October 23, 2015, the blast resulted in roughly 80,000 metric tons of methane leaking into the air, triggering health problems for nearby residents. Today, some health officials are reporting they are seeing multiple people with similar cancers. In one case, a young girl, Aliyah Hall, contracted a rare form of cancer known as acute myeloid leukemia. According to the American Cancer Society, this type of cancer, which is common in older people, starts in the bone marrow but can quickly move into the bloodstream. Risk factors for developing the illness include exposure to certain chemicals such as benzene, which is used in oil refineries, chemical plants, and gasoline-related industries. And of course, when benzene is mixed with toluene, ethylene, and xylene, we have the BTEX mix, which are horrendously toxic. So, of course, the orthodox response from both the government and the industry is, but that can never happen here. And yet we've heard exactly the same palliatives thrown out to the communities in the US, Canada, Australia, and wherever else this industry has managed to establish a footprint. So when we talk about the chemicals, I have a document here, which is the after-action review following a blowout at a Chevron well in Appalachia. And in this document, it actually lists the chemicals, so we have it on screen here, that were being tested for in the atmosphere. Now, this is information that was available to the emergency services, so they knew precisely what to test for. So, I mean, I get the sense, Helen, that, we are literally dealing with gross incompetence, which is amateurish in the extreme, and nobody, not just in the Fylde, but nobody across the north of England in the sacrifice zone of the licensed areas should be comfortable that this industry is being allowed to proceed without any reference to emergency response plans. So where do we go from here?
I think the first thing that people need to do is be aware that these questions have been asked, and also to add their voice to mine and other people who have been asking those questions. It is not for us to assume that these things will not happen. It is for us to insist that in the event that they do, that there is a mechanism that is able to evacuate thousands of, let's just talk about the school children alone. There are other people that matter. There were the horses at K9, there were the dogs, there is horses, there is dogs, there is elderly people that would have mobility issues. How are we going to evacuate thousands of people under a potentially toxic gas cloud within, 60 minutes of an alarm going off? And what is that alarm? What would it sound like? Do we know what that alarm is? Where would people go in an exclusion zone? What are the questions that you would want answering if all of a sudden Preston New Road exploded, and or if it didn't, and there was a unexploded gas leak, and something that was drifting down the valley, which you couldn't see, as toxic as hydrogen sulfide, started to make people very ill, or even worse, kill them. What questions would you want answering, and who would you need to ask those to? So I think that we should be asking these questions to the council. I think that we need to be asking Lancashire County Council what their role is in facilitating the police to have an emergency evacuation zone. I think we need to demand answers from the police and the fire service in how they're going to carry that out. And I want to hear that all of the schools actually know what they are doing, and I want them to communicate that with the parents. So I would urge all parents with children at local schools to ask what will happen in the event of an incident on that well site. How will I be able to get my child out of that school, or where will you be keeping them safe?
That is an excellent point. People need to ask the questions. And as you rightly say, people have been asking the questions and they've been fobbed off. I know that one of the members of the community liaison group has been asking these questions and is just consistently fobbed off. So how can we help people come up with the questions? Well, let me refer people to this document here, and you can find this online. It's from Southwest Pennsylvania Environmental Health Project. And it's a fairly succinct document, so it doesn't need a great deal of study. And here is the summary. Emergency preparedness and response is an obvious necessity for residents living near wells, compressor stations, and other activities related to unconventional oil and gas development, or fracking. An emergency situation arising from a spill, explosion, or other crisis can impact health, threaten natural resources, or require evacuation. It goes on, in southwestern Pennsylvania, wildfire experts, wild well control, are sometimes contracted to resolve unconventional oil and gas development emergency situations using their special training and equipment. Talk with your local officials to determine how emergencies are handled in your community. Now, this issue of well control is very, very significant because in the US, because of the propensity for wells to blow out, then there are a number of specialist firefighting companies, obviously Safety Boss, Wild Well Control, Boots and Coots, and of course Red Adair, to name but four, and CUD, who responded at Powhatan, so that's 5. And then there are other smaller companies. In the UK, we don't have any experience of that. In fact, when we have had blowouts, we've had to fly in the specialist teams from the USA, just like we did for Piper Alpha 30 years ago. So in the event of a blowout, where are the wild well control specialists coming from? Would it mean that there has to be an evacuation that would be in place for an absolute minimum of 24 hours, pending the arrival of a specialist team, perhaps from the US or from further afield? Well, this document also has a list of questions, and you may not be able to read it on a small screen, certainly not if you're watching it on a phone, but do Google this document. It's all you've got to put in is Southwest Pennsylvania emergency preparedness. But here's a list of 11 questions, and it says, if you do attend a local emergency planning committee or other community meeting related to unconventional oil and gas development, related emergency response and preparedness, the questions prepared below may be helpful in guiding your discussion. So I'm going to quickly run through the questions here. What does the county have in place for natural gas emergency training? Are tabletop exercises, discussion-based sessions for emergency situations held? And if so, how often? Have local first responders attended a training session? Have first responders visited a well site, compressor station and processing plant? Do all first responders know where pipelines are located and what pressures they operate at? Are trainings paid for by the natural gas companies or out of the public purse? Are hazardous material emergency response preparedness reports public information? And if so, where can one access them? Do local planning committees have access to proprietary chemical information at every site? And is this information communicated to first responders? Local legislation in the US states that each emergency plan shall be made available to the general public during normal working hours. What can you tell us about the local emergency plans? what hospitals, schools, daycare centres are within a 1 mile radius of each drill pad, compressor station, process plant? And do you have contact information for all? And finally, how would you conduct an evacuation at a school or hospital in our community? Is there sufficient transportation to conduct an evacuation? And, you know, if anybody is watching this now from the emergency services, from the local authority, from central government, they should be hanging their heads in absolute shame. And, you know, based on our discussion tonight, Helen, I'm sure you would join me in calling upon Greg Clark, Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, and James Brokenshire, the Communities Minister, to call an immediate moratorium on all further work on unconventional oil and gas development in the UK, pending the establishment of these plans. It is not enough to cut and paste these documents from the web. What is important is that these plans are communicated to all of the people they apply to, and that in the event of an emergency, every one of those people knows how these multi-services would come together in a cohesive and coherent fashion to effect a full emergency response. Your thoughts, Helen?
Thanks, Ian. I couldn't have put it better myself. Greg Clark must not and should not sign off the frack at Preston New Road until he has on his desk an actual concrete plan for the emergency evacuation of Preston New Road and the surrounding community. It is corporate manslaughter if Quadrilla do not provide this, and it is government incompetence of, I think, the order that we've only just been getting over with Grenfell for him to fail to do that. I also think that the local hospitals should join the emergency services in asking how they would cope with being able to see the number of patients that they would in the event of such an incident. We need a really coordinated response, and we need it now. And if we don't have it now, we must not frack. No evac, no frack.
Well, I think that this is quite possibly the most important episode of Fracking Nightmare we've broadcast yet. And if you've listened to even just part of this discussion, then, and you live in an area that is being targeted by the unconventional oil and gas industry, then you need to participate in the process. If you don't, then basically I think the prognosis is very clear. You have a government and an industry that doesn't want to discuss emergency response plans in case you suddenly realize that there are significant risks associated with this industry. And that is malfeasance in public office. And the individuals will be held to account. There is no one who cannot be aware that they are culpable unless they take the appropriate action. And in the first instance, the appropriate action is to put that moratorium in place, because these emergency response plans are not put together in 5 minutes or 5 weeks or even 5 months. So Helen, I think that it was extremely synchronistic that you were available to join me this evening. And thank you so much for your sterling work. And of course, it would be remiss of me not to mention Benjamin Dean, who has also put in a number of Freedom of Information requests on similar subjects, and has actually shared with me the letter that he has sent to Greg Clark, effectively summarizing pretty much everything that we've been talking about this evening. So it is not possible for Greg Clark to say that he is not aware or that he has been misled. And if we've got it wrong, I mean, there is the very remote outside possibility that we've got it wrong. And all these plans are in fact in place. They simply haven't been communicated to anybody. which is as good as them not actually existing at all. So if you're on the Fylde Peninsula, or you work anywhere near Preston New Road, you need to be getting on the case of the local authority, the emergency services, your MPs, the industry themselves, and in particular, Greg Clark and James Brockenshire. Helen, any last, I have to be careful how I phrase that, I would say any last words. Any final words of wisdom?
I'd just like to say that I really support the fire service and the police in the work that they would be doing at this time, and to say that I actually also have your interests at heart, because in serving the public, you too would be in danger. And I really hope that this doesn't land on our wonderful public servants. To deal with this level of incompetence is not something that they should pay the price of their lives potentially for, nor is it for the community. So whatever it is you believe in, I ask you to send up your prayers now to actually take care of the residents in the local area around Preston New Road. This is very, very important.
Helen, thank you so much for joining me this evening. And I'll be back with another episode of Fracking Nightmare, I think in 2 or maybe 3 weeks, but I will absolutely be back tomorrow morning with an 8:30 live stream. So join me on either my Facebook page, Ian Rowland Crane, or on the Ian R. Crane YouTube channel tomorrow and most mornings, weekdays at 8:30 a.m. Thanks a lot. Get on the case.